Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. Hopefully you've got some blue skies and the rain has finally passed on, and you're sitting comfortably, and you had a chance to look at some of the Alta's story in the video that was playing for the last 5 minutes about our values and our customer experience and just the longevity of the organization. So today I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favorite topics, which is the conversation around data and information and value, and how often we find it quite a difficult conversation to have, where we move from a sort of an abstract concept to something that's a bit more tangible. The word tangible is not an accidental use of the word. You'll find me drilling into that a little bit later on in the webinar. So it's trying to give you some of those tools and techniques that's going to help you have that conversation. So I'm going to be outlining the issue. One of my colleagues, when I asked them to review my slide deck, I started off with just issue. But kindly, he actually indicated that it's not just an issue, it's the issue when we're dealing with data at the moment, is this concept of realizing value, quantifying what that value is, and using it to add value to the business. So we're going to be talking about what that issue is, and then I'm going to give you some techniques around how do you have those conversations if you're challenged to justify the value of a project or a data asset that's being created. How are you going to go around that? What are some of the techniques that we can apply to measure value, and what are some of the dimensions, using a modeling type term? What are those attributes or dimensions of data that makes one particular data asset more valuable than, say, the next one? Then we're going to talk about how do we add value to data. So if we have merely curated or gathered a set of data, how do we take that from a fairly simple value proposition to something that is far more valuable? And again, how do we have that conversation around that? And how do we add value in how do we deliver data? So not only the data itself, but as a data analytics department, we might want to ponder how do we interact with the customers of that data so that they feel that we've had added value to merely serving up a set of information. Preserving, so this is a little bit more about what not to do. So how do we avoid removing value from the information that we've spent so much time acquiring? And then some examples that are talking about organizations or projects that I've been involved with, where we've gone from having a business problem, we've invested an amount of time building a solution through a project's life cycle, and how has that actually changed the organization and added value to that organization in a measurable way. So it's fairly easy to talk about abstract concepts, but how have we done that in a tangible way that you could have a conversation with your CFO and say, well, here's what you spent, this is the outcome that you've achieved, and this is the saving that you've managed to deliver. So the data issue. So it's coming back to one of my pet hates is that as an industry, we very often use cliches, things like data is valuable or data is an asset. And I think I'm imagining everyone on this webinar is probably convinced that, yeah, it is valuable. We know it's valuable. Intuitively, we know that there's a purpose to what we do, that we add value, that the data assets that we spend a lot of time building and managing are important to the business. But the struggle is how do we move beyond simple statements like data is valuable or data is an asset? The real crux of the question is, how valuable is that data? That's the purpose of this webinar, is to help you quantify. Because the problem is that if we can't say how valuable a piece of data or a piece of information or a project that is about to be delivered or a data platform is, then how do we go ahead and request that funding? So that's that awkward conversation when you're about to put together a business case and you've got all the numbers together, you know, how long it's going to cost, how much it's going to cost to operate each year, how long it's going to cost to build it, what sort of features it's going to have. But the real question often when you get to the exec level is, so, you know, why would we do this? And traditionally, it's kind of, it's been quite a difficult conversation to have because we don't really have those methods and means in order to say, well, it's going to necessarily improve insights. Well, again, what does that mean? Once we can answer those sorts of questions as well, it helps us have a meaningful communication about some of the ideas around, for example, data governance. So I've been to many lectures and presentations where people talk about the importance of data stewardship, data quality, the issue to business when quality is not adequate. But again, they always end up in this sort of pause where it's hard to actually quantify what does that actually mean. So people talk about, well, if we did a mail out of communication and the addresses were wrong, then you can quantify the returned emails or the returned letters, the promotional material. And so this webinar is about putting a little bit more structure around those sorts of conversations. And then this is the other topic is, if we're talking about building data and we're building information platforms and we're acquiring data and creating data assets, ultimately, in certain cases, they could have a saleable value. So if an organization, even if they hadn't intended to sell a data warehouse, let's say that the organization was sold and part of that sale, the assets were valued, and that data warehouse, it probably would also be valued as an asset in the sale. So we're not talking about selling data for which in an inappropriate manner. We're talking about the sale of a data asset that belonged to an organization. There are, of course, instances where data was modeled or data sets were created with the intent of selling it as well. But again, this webinar is all assuming that that's for legitimate reasons. Excuse me, I've got a plane going over. So if we can't answer those questions, we're going to be searching for words when we're asked the question, so what's the return on investment of building this data platform? How will it improve insights in the organization? You know, one of those cliches that we often have in our industry is actionable insights. Well, okay, yeah, that's important. But what do those insights actually deliver to us? What is the dollar value potentially, or what is the efficiency saving, or what is the reduction in risk that may occur in the organization because we've built this solution? How is delivering self-service value add? You know, what does that mean to an end user that we've enabled them to go and self-serve? What does that mean to them in their day-to-day role? And how do we have some sort of measurable impact? So we know, well, it actually saved 1.8 FTEs on month-end reporting. What is the benefits of improved data quality? And you know, why should we capture data that potentially we don't have an immediate need for? So one of the issues that we've come across as an industry is, you know, the data swamp and the ability to capture as much data as we want into data lakes or any alternative platform that we can come up with. So what value does that have? And is it something we should even do, given that we don't immediately have a purpose for it? I should have mentioned before I kicked off that please raise questions during the webinar. We will attend to them afterwards. When I've got panelists who can help moderate that process. So why is it hard I think that it comes back to one of the words that I used in the start of the presentation was this lack of tangible qualities that data has. It's not like we've created a building, we've not put a product on a shelf, we've not purchased a vehicle that's put into the fleet. So I think that the challenge is that it's and the use of words like cloud and fluffy, they're all sort of fairly abstract concepts. And I think that's the very crux of the issue with talking about data, information, and value. Maturity and techniques. I don't think there are quite a few articles and thought leaders in this space where we talk about value, but it's not something which I think is widely agreed upon or used. It's not a precise science. So given that we're heading towards this idea of an intangible asset, concepts like fair value and reasonableness all come into play. So which means we go from this very precise physical tangible asset to a slightly opinion-based value of intangible assets. And it's hard for us. I'm an IT person, and this isn't a journey that we can go on our own without having a conversation with finance, who are really, they're the masters of this domain. We can come to them with our opinions and our evidence and describe what we feel are the value propositions for a particular project or data asset. So I will continue talking about the issues, how we measure that information, how we measure the value, how we add, preserve, and then some examples of projects that I've been working on. So this reinforces what I said earlier, is that we're not talking about the sale of data for nefarious reasons. We're not talking about something which violates privacy principles. We're talking about data that's been collected and is being used in accordance with the conditions that it was acquired, which I guess is the crux of what we're doing. And it doesn't mean that, the sale of data doesn't mean it's a negative thing. Obviously, we've had stories of people like Cambridge Analytica, and this is completely different to that. This is talking about organizations that are sold and have data assets, or organizations that are based on data, or the sale of data, for example, Bloomberg, or a platform like LinkedIn, which is effectively very low in physical, tangible assets, but quite high, and it's completely operated on by intangible data assets. Thanks again to one of my colleagues who suggested the analogy of a diamond. So a lot of what we do with data is we acquire the raw data in its rock form that we're hoping is going to contain the odd diamond or jewel or something of great value. But it's really not until we model and transform and process and add business rules and check for data quality do we actually realize that value. So that valuable jewel that we're hoping is in the middle of that rock. And so value to me is something that talks about its intrinsic value or its perceived value. So I think it's reasonable for us to say that there is an element of branding with data, and the perception of value doesn't mean that it's not value in pretending that it is, but I think it's also important that we take that leadership position in organizations and actually advocate and promote the data asset that we have created to make sure that the perception of value actually matches the truth of the matter, that we have got these incredibly rich and valuable assets that we need to make sure that are used appropriately. So value can manifest itself in many ways. So we can find that, coming back to the example of month-end reporting for a group exec, where potentially he's got or she has a team of people who are spending hours a week, if not days, consolidating information in Excel, probably doing VLOOKUPs and sorting and doing all sorts of labor-intensive tasks. So the value that data and information can bring to that scenario obviously is fairly simple. We can reduce that overhead of people. We can get them to do more interesting roles. So instead of spending 80% of their time actually manually cobbling together data sets, we can let them go off and do 80% of their time doing insight providing activities and analytics. So that's a fairly simple one. Let's talk also to those efficiencies. So how we optimize processes. So there's less labor-intensive activities around data, and that we have streamlined the processes so that they are provided with the opportunity to self-serve. They go and ask their own questions. They don't have to come to the IT department and ask for us to write a query or a report or a dashboard or build a cube. So it's all about enabling those efficiencies through data. We can reduce risk, and by looking for abnormal behavior. So it might be, so risk, obviously there's only a cost impact if the risk actually comes to bear, or if there's a penalty by a regulator. So the value that the data provides in that instance is avoiding that consequence of there being an issue. But it also could be something around, I did a project for a large construction organization, and they were trying to make sure that they were billing for everything that they were doing. And so trying to avoid those issues with revenue leakage, where the amount of time a piece of equipment was being used correlates to the amount of time that the person who was leasing the vehicle. So avoiding those issues where things are being dropped on the floor, we can use data to actually save that money. Providing insights again, and lastly, external value should the data set actually ever be sold, or again, part of an organization. This is drilling again back into one of those cliches that we've probably all used. The data is an asset, and I don't think anyone's going to debate that. It's been acquired, whether it's owned and controlled. So these are some of the attributes that an asset needs to have from a finance perspective for it to be considered an asset. But I think we need to drill one level down below this, because data is just not a simple sort of asset. We need to compare the two classes where we've got tangible assets, so cash, we've got inventory, property, vehicles, furniture, any number of things that we can physically go and place our hands on. And then we need to consider the alternative type of asset, which is an intangible asset. And there we're stepping into that slightly non-science-based valuation of assets. So we've got things like goodwill and patents and brands and copyright, and all of these things require some sort of value judgment and some sort of evidence to be able to arrive at a value for them. And I contend that data falls within that intangible category. So when we're talking about intangible assets, these are some of the tests that an asset needs to pass in order to fall into that category. Now, obviously, this is dependent on Australian accounting rules. Depending on whereabouts in the world you are, you may be subject to different criteria. So first and foremost, it's not a physical thing. There's technical feasibility of completing the asset. So let's assume that we're partway through the build of a project. Can it be valued? Yes, it can, providing that there's technical feasibility of actually completing that project, and that there's an intention to complete it, and that the business has the ability to use that information or sell that information. And it's able to generate probable future economic benefits. So again, going back to that, revenue generation, cost reduction, etc. The ability to have adequate technical, financial, and other resources to complete the development. So it's not enough to say we want to complete it, but there's adequate technical support to do so. And that the project has been able to measure the cost in creating that data asset. So that's all going to help in valuing what it is worth, because if we've spent 2 years building a large data asset, obviously we know how much it costs to do that. We know what the various costs associated with that are. And that enables us, that gives us a dimension by which to value that asset. So yes, when are we more likely to have these conversations? So probably one of the most frequent times I come across it is when I'm being asked to contribute on a business case or prepare a business case. And in those circumstances, we need to pitch a proposal with justification for wanting to create this information. So how are we going to acquire the data? How are we going to model it, transform it, cleanse it, curate it, catalog it, and then present it to an end user? Other circumstances are where we have an existing platform of some sort, and that we want to augment it with an additional set of information, or we might want to scale out the storage or the compute. Lastly, we need to maintain it. So again, we come back to those roles of stewardship and ownership and data analytics department. So why would you want to employ those type of resources, and what value are they going to present in preparing and delivering data and information to the organization? So these are the dimensions that I find most useful when we're having these conversations. So was the data purchased, was it sourced from an external organization? Was it acquired from a free open source like Bureau of Meteorology? How much did it cost to capture it and store it? So again, that comes back to the measuring the expenditure in order to create the asset in the first place, gives it a dimension of value. Is it perceived to have value? So that's about that conversation that you need to have with the stakeholders in the organization and the advocates that you have who use the information. So do they see a value proposition in what data you've acquired, and also not just what you've acquired, but also how you deliver that to them, and those conversations that you can have with your stakeholders about the information you have, and describe to them the opportunities that presents itself. Is it predictive in nature? Unfortunately, we still, as an industry, spend too much time doing operational reporting that is retrospective. Luckily, with the advent of AI and ML, we're getting a bit more predictive in our analytics. And so I contend that something which is looking at an event that took place a month ago about how many widgets were created is far less valuable than something which is predictive around the churn of, say, the discontinuation of a student at a university. That leads me to the quality. So is it trusted? Do people always shudder when they're required to report off the data set because they realize that actually there are quite a few anomalies and that you really can't make a confident decision using it? Scalability again comes into the topic. Completeness. So completeness is, for me, if I take the analogy of, say, some slightly old school concepts of a data mart versus a data warehouse, a data mart is probably going to be very specific to a particular line of business. whereas the data warehouse is an enterprise-wide asset. Now, for me, obviously, the greater the number of data sources that go into this repository is going to lead to the increase in value and the great opportunity to have insights when consolidating, combining different data sets in your analytical activities. So it's really around that breadth of the data set and also the granularity. So if you've got something which is aggregated at a point where you really can't do a lot with it in order to, say, meet with a privacy requirement, it's far less useful than that transactional atomic information that underpins it. Uniqueness, is it something that's widely available in the open data set? Margin, I've highlighted these two because I think they're probably, when you're having those conversations, they're probably the first two which people are going to either challenge you on or ask you to justify. So, you know, that perception of value is going to get you across the line. If you've already got a business that is excited about the information that you have and you're providing, that perception of value is going to help you in any conversation around budget or business cases. The next one is probably one of the most obvious as well. Does it help revenue creation or does it facilitate cost savings? And finally, is it used? So this comes back a little bit to one of the topics that I raised around when do we choose to store data. Using the diamond analogy, do we keep those rocks in case they're going to have some diamonds in them, or do we say, actually, you know what, it's so unlikely that there's going to be great insights available within that information that, you know what, let's not store it until we actually have a purpose for it. So if you've got a warehouse full of or a lake full of information that no one goes to, you really need to question the fact that you've spent the time and the money acquiring it and then you're paying for the storage of it, given that really there doesn't seem to be a compelling business case for it at the moment. So drilling into those two, the topic of revenue, obviously we're talking about increased revenue. So can we have that conversation with our finance department about bottom line impacts of the information that we are providing them or proposing that we're going to acquire? Are we going to talk about decreased costs of doing business? So is it going to directly impact or headcount, or is it going to allow us to redeploy staff so that instead of doing the laborious number crunching activities, that they're actually going to be able to add real value and also conversely, you know, have a much more enjoyable life at work if they're not constantly doing battle with Excel, and decreased risk to an organization. So are we going to avoid fines from regulators? Are we going to avoid data breaches and things of that nature? This is an approach that I've seen used effectively, and I often use in these sorts of conversations where we're looking for an outcome, but we're not quite sure of the path that we need to get there. So we're not quite sure of the inputs, for example, but we know that when we're building our proposal or our request for funding or our business case, that we know what the outcome is. So if we look at this diagram here, we can see that we can move in either direction. So we can set value targets as outcomes when we're planning a project. We've got something that is motivating us to even start this exercise, and that outcome is the value proposition of the project. And then when we've actually delivered it, it then allows us to measure the actual value that, you know, did we actually deliver on our promise? And it helps keep people focused on not losing their way during the project cycle and suddenly forgetting what was the initial purpose of what we're doing. You know, expecting people to come back and actually measure against what was delivered versus what was proposed is a very powerful means for keeping people's focus on the value proposition with regards to the project. So if we look here, we can see that we've got an outcome that we might first propose. Then we look at the effects that we need to see in order to deliver that outcome. We've got the usage of the data. You know, so we've got who is going to use this, what's the outputs, is it a project-based activity or is it an ad hoc task, and what are the inputs. So in the planning phase, we go from outcome to input, and then once we've completed the delivery, we then go and we look conversely from the inputs all the way through to the outcome. We measure what was the success of the project in delivering those value propositions that we proposed when the project commenced. Now, just because we've got a data asset or an information asset doesn't mean that we can't add to it. So coming back to our diamond and our rock analogy, it's all about refining, extracting, and processing that information and making sure that it's of the required quality. If it's not of the required quality, making sure that we communicate openly about, well, what's the magnitude of this issue? Is it a 5% of the information has a compromised level of quality? And then we can spin that around to say, well, actually 95% of what we have here is trusted, is authenticated, we know the lineage, and you can use it for any number of decisions. So it's sure, quality can always be an issue, but it's also something that we can increase, measure, and communicate effectively. Is it being more broadly used? Again, usage implies value. So are we communicating adequately across business units? Are we sharing the information? Are we over governing and suddenly saying, well, actually, no, this is my information and you can't share it, or another department can't have access to it? We can add the number of sources. You know, the greater number of sources that we bring into a data set, the greater the number of correlations that we can find. Weather stats are often a favorite data set to add. You know, I've seen a number of situations where workplace injuries have suddenly become far more apparent when we add a free data set that includes the rainfall or the humidity or the ultraviolet radiation or the temperature that might have occurred on the day. And those sorts of correlations become much more relevant and the data becomes much more valuable when we can bring them together. Cataloging, so let's not just acquire information, model it and put it in a vault that people really don't have a lot of insights about what that vault contains. So about cataloging, describing, sharing, and again, it's that branding and it's about that sharing your information with business units within the organization and advocates within those departments. And I think another one which we're seeing much more commonly now is this, the notion of an overnight batch is so last millennium. It's much more about high latency of data that is available when you need it. It's not what happened yesterday, it's what happened at lunchtime or what happened an hour ago. So thinking about by default having data latency that meets business expectations and isn't just the easy option of doing an overnight load. This is something which I've found to be very useful, and it's something that I try and always introduce into conversations with, certainly with data governance teams and also with end users. There's this notion of bronze, silver, and gold, or you can use any ruby, gold, ruby, diamond, and silver, whatever icons and acronyms that you want to use, but it's this idea that as we progress data from its raw state to its presented state, and again, presented is fairly an open term, but could be modeled, it could be presented in a visualization of some sort. As the data progresses from one end of the pipeline to the next, we see the value of that information increase because we've applied business rules, we've cleansed, we've quarantined records that are of dubious quality, we've reported on quality issues, we've catalogued, we've done all those things. So this helps us with those conversations around, so what is this information worth? Well, it really depends on what layer of the architecture we're talking about also. So if we're talking about a raw area which is potentially volatile or contains deltas, the value really is quite low. And that brings me back to that idea of storing information for the sake of storing it. Well, if it's really is that untransformed and curated, then really the value proposition of that is quite low in comparison to something where a team has decided to dimensionally model, or whichever approach they've taken, so that it's full of business insights and it's consumable by a business user. And they're not having to delve into joining data sets and third normal form and cardinality and all those sorts of things. So as we progress through the layers of architecture that are relevant to the solution, you're also going to see that the value proposition is different from the start to the finish. Fairly obvious, otherwise why would we bother doing it? This is one of my favorite topics, and it's around preserving information, preserving value, and the idea of not over-governing. Far too often, and for genuinely good intent, people say, I don't want to expose this information because I don't know what you're going to use it for, or it's not in the presentation layer, it's in some layer beneath that, or you haven't filled in the right forms. And I'm not saying that governance doesn't have its place. Absolutely it does, certainly in the world of that we live in now around privacy concerns and certification and all those good things, which are completely valid. But one of my hot topics is, from a governance perspective, if you want people to value your data, you can't keep it locked away, because what will happen is that they'll find a method of generating a report, exporting it to Excel, create an Access database or an Excel database, or whatever method they want to use, and they will work around that, and they will negate the value proposition of the data repository that you and a team have just spent 6 months building. So it's all about fit for purpose governance, so that the business gets value, the end user, the customer, internal customer, external customer, all get value for what you've spent so much time doing, without creating a risk to the organization and sort of just opening the doors and letting people use the data, whichever data they want to use. And this, again, I think this is a topic that I've talked about a little bit previously, is, you know, that storage for the sake of storing. It really has, it's quite a difficult justification if you're having to pay vast amounts of storage costs in AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, wherever you're paying for that storage, or even on-prem, if you haven't got some sort of justification for why you've spent all that time acquiring and how much all that money you're spending maintaining it month on month if you're not actually using it. So I get that there are strategic reasons why a project might start storing data, because they know that within 6 months or 12 months, 18 months, there's going to be a project that needs that information. But I think we really need to challenge ourselves about storing for the sake of storing, because then how can we have that conversation about the value, the purpose, the reason, for doing so. Demonstrating value. It talks a little bit about the governance process that I mentioned earlier, and it also touches on change management to a certain extent. It's about how do we find those people in the organization who have an appetite for data, they've got a problem, and they're crying out for help. What I suggest is that you actively find those people, target them, and where possible, you find opportunities to help them, because they will, on your behalf, act as advocates. They will also promote the value proposition of what you're doing. And if you've got someone like this, or a business unit or a department that's actively promoting the work that you're doing in a data analytics department, what you're going to find is that those conversations around business cases, budget, are much easier to have when you've got other people in the organization who are talking on your behalf. Obviously, when you're promoting yourself, there's a pinch of salt about why we should do things. But if you have other departments, the finance department, purchasing, whichever, who are saying there is this incredible data asset that's available in the organization, the quality is great, the service level is amazing, we know exactly what it contains, that is a really powerful message in internal communication. Demonstrating, so actively, don't be embarrassed around data quality issues. You know, they're always going to exist. You're never going to get rid of them entirely, but it's about turning that conversation around of saying, yes, we're actively monitoring quality issues, and not only are we actively monitoring, but we can see how it's trending and improving. And again, that talks to that conversation around value, is that, well, you know, if 5 months ago, when we had this data quality issue with purchase orders missing delivery addresses, and now we've got an improvement in 3%, then clearly we've already added value to that information by improving the data quality. And again, it helps with that ongoing conversation that we have with users of information, where we can demonstrate and articulate the value proposition that we bring to the table. Use language like bronze, silver, and gold, or whichever equivalent you want to use. And place, what I've often do is try and place some sort of quality statement, value statement, icon on the dashboard, so that when people are using it, they say, oh, this is gold standard in data. And it talks to that value proposition again of how do we make sure that people understand how, and we're not, again, we're not trying to pretend that things are more valuable than they are. It's about making sure people realize how valuable they are by being open and just saying, listen, this data is, we know the lineage, we know the source, we know that any data quality or data cleansing or name and address matching has been applied to it. And so we can really be confident about how important this information is. Examples. I've probably talked about a few of these during the webinar so far. So one of the favorites for me are utilities. I'm working for a large logistics company at the moment, where we're looking at locomotives and, you know, what sort of telemetry exists that allows us to predict failures. So it's, again, how do we avoid over-servicing equipment? You know, do we need to change the oil on a pump in a water treatment plant as frequently as the manufacturer says? Can we predict when a failure is going to occur because the acoustic signature on a bearing has changed slightly? So we've got continuity of service, but we're also not over maintaining equipment. So those are some great examples, tangible examples of where there's been a real dollar saving. Universities, banks, telcos, they all fall into that churn modeling situation where the cost of acquiring a customer or a student is quite high. The impact of losing them obviously is equally as significant, if not more so, when you look at the longevity of that relationship. And so how do we look for patterns that exist within the data that helps them interact with the student or the customer and avoid that churn? Again, that's coming back to one of those dimensions of predictive data sets being much more valuable than retrospective. Construction companies that have been able to streamline their month-end reporting, again, I think we've talked about that. One of the interesting ones that I've seen is where an organization aggregated the relationship they had with a supplier, which had many, many different branches. And in being able to aggregate that relationship and looking at it at a holistic level, they were able to have a much more meaningful conversation about how much they were actually purchasing and also whether or not they were getting the appropriate pricing when purchasing the raw materials that they were using. I think we've gone through most of these in the past. Airlines reducing waste costs is probably something I haven't talked about, so that we're not catering for passengers on the plane who aren't going to actually consume meals. The better stacking of an aircraft belly to make sure that space utilization is optimal. So conclusions. I think the first thing for me when I was putting together this webinar is to make sure that we as technologists, I'm assuming that most people on this webinar fall within the IT department, we need to have a conversation with finance because we're not the experts in things like intangible assets. And I think the more readily we have that conversation, the more likely we're going to have that partnership, and we're going to be able to get their guidance in what do they look at when they consider value, because a lot about what they do day to day is about estimating values of organizations and their assets. So I think I would suggest that you have that conversation and make sure it's something that they're comfortable with. One of the topics that you'll see on the internet frequently is data on the balance sheet. If you've got a CFO that has no interest in data on the balance sheet, then you're not really going to get very far with it. And it doesn't mean that you can't do a lot of the things that I'm advocating, or you can't use this framework that I use when I'm faced with the same problem. It just means that you're going to have a slightly different conversation and realize that maybe you're just going to be looking at advocates, you're going to be looking at data quality, and those types of dimensions, latency, uniqueness, gold, silver, bronze standards. But you may never get to a point where you go to the CFO and says, I've just built you this incredible X number of dollars thing that I expect to see you on the year-end reports, because they're probably not going to go for that. Make sure that data privacy is, and the legislation that is relevant to your particular country is always adhered to. That you're applying the accounting laws that are appropriate. And lastly, that we've got this, it is really a little bit, there's a bit of art and there's a bit of science in this process, which I think is why traditionally we've struggled with it, and also why you see some organizations that are undervalue, and some organizations that overvalue their data assets, is that there's no proven or agreed on way of doing this, and there is an element of opinion that is brought into these situations. All right, so that concludes the webinar. I'm going to see if we have any questions from participants. Okay, we don't have anything coming up at the moment. So how we continue with this is that we'll be publishing a link to the audio for this. So this is being recorded. We'll also publish some takeaway documentation PDFs on the slide deck. We would encourage you, please, to reach out with opinions. We probably all face these problems day to day, so I'd love to have a dialogue around this. So please reach out to me at Altus Consulting, and we can take this discussion to the next step. Thank you, everybody.